Okay. Oh, can you all hear my dog barking in the background? Sorry about that. Okay, so we're going to get started. Thank you everyone for joining us tonight. I am Julie Zuckerman, the author of the Book of Jeremiah. And for those of you who have been to these events before, you've heard my whole opening spiel, but we have a lot of new people also, so I want to give you a little introduction to Literary Modiin. For those of you who don't know, Modiin is a planned city in Israel, about halfway between Jerusalem and Tel Aviv. It's very close to the airport. So once the airport opens up to tourists, hopefully you'll all come and visit us next time you're here. We have a really large population of English speakers here. So in June 2019, right after my book came out, I started Literary Modiin as a way of bringing local Israel-based authors to the large community of English readers. We had a few in-person events, and then last year when the pandemic hit, we switched to a virtual format, and I just counted and realized that tonight is our 8th virtual event. And it's been a silver lining of the pandemic for me anyway, because it allows me to hear from authors from all over and to also welcome attendees from all over. We have a bunch of people, a bunch of authors who were at previous events here with us tonight. So I'm going to share my screen in a minute and you can see all the books of the authors we posted. Let me do that now. Hang on. I'll just scroll down a bit so you can see everyone's going to get a link to this list tomorrow and a thank you email. But I just want to say welcome to, I think Lori Banoff-Kaufman is here, and Jennifer Rosner is here, and Sandel Morris, and Evan Fallenberg, and Erica Dreyfus, and Erin Hamburger, and Sarah Lipman. If anybody else is still here, then I didn't thank and I didn't welcome you. Sorry. Maybe R.L. Maisie is also here. I don't remember. Anyway, here is the list, and you'll get it tomorrow. But I encourage you to check out all of those books because they're all wonderful. And the format for today's event is that each author will be speaking for about 15 minutes, and then we'll open it up to questions. Everyone is on mute, as I said. So if you have any questions, just put them in the chat box. I am unable to broadcast this live on Facebook for some reason, but I am recording this, and so I'm going to put this up on YouTube tomorrow. One more thing, we already have the April event also on the calendar for April 25th, and I'm going to put that link in the chat later on so you can already register. And that is with Edna Shemish, Chaviva Ner David, and Rachel Neve Midbar. So save the date, register now. Okay, now I'm going to get started and introduce you to our authors. So first up, I'm going to ask Jane Bernstein to speak. The Face Tells the Secret, it's right here, is Jane's 5th book for adults. It was named one of the top books for 2020 by Hadassah Magazine. She's an avid essayist, a lapsed screenwriter, and the co-author of a children's book, Gina from Siberia, with her daughter, Charlotte Glynn. Jane's grants and awards include 2 National Endowment Fellowships in Creative Writing and a Fulbright Fellowship at Bar-Ilan University. She is a professor of English and a member of the Creative Writing Program at Carnegie Mellon University. So now, Jane, I think I need to unmute you. Hold on, and then I'm going to mute myself so you don't have to hear my dog.
Wait a second. All right, okay. Am I unmuted?
No, you're great. Take it away.
Okay, good. Thank you. Okay, I'm going to look at my clock here and Julie wave frantically if I go for too long. I am really thrilled to be here. Thank you, Julie, for inviting me, and thank you, Rachel and Avi, for being part of this. I'm going to try not to tear up here. I'm going to say a couple of words about how The Face Tells the Secret came to be. It was a pretty mysterious process for me. So my background is basically, I started my writing life as a writer of fiction, and for a long period of time, fiction was basically what I loved most to read and all I was interested in writing. Actually, that's still true. And then in the 1980s, I took a really long turn, and for the next 20 years, I wrote mostly memoir, essays and books. What spurred the change from fiction to memoir was that my second daughter, Rachel, who was born in 1983, had many medical and developmental problems. Her birth blasted me from my dream life, but it also spurred a lot of questions from me as a parent and as a human being. And memoir was a way for me to use the techniques I'd learned as a writer of fiction to tell a story that was directly from my life. So for me, the craft of writing fiction and memoir is much the same, but the genesis is incredibly different. For a long time, I couldn't actually have said exactly how The Face Tells the Secret came to be. All I knew was that I was really interested in writing a novel about a protagonist, a woman who was raised without context. That is, she was raised with absolutely no sense of who she was as a human being, no family history, no stories, no family stories, no sense of culture, no anything. I was really interested in that. So later I could say that The Face Tells the Secret was a novel about the price of silence. And then much later, I began to see that these elements from my own life made their way into a novel that is really thematically very close to me, but the events bear no relationship to the events in my own actual life. So this is one moment. One evening, a very long time ago, I went to my parents' house for dinner, and my father and I were sitting alone at the table. He was at that point in the middle stage of dementia. He'd thrown away his glasses, and he was often confused, but he still had some language. And when my mother was out of earshot, he leaned all the way across the table and asked me, "Wasn't there another one?" And a chill went through me because, in fact, there had been another one. It was my older sister, Laura, who had been murdered. So if every book every book for most writers, I think, comes from something that haunts us as writers. This book, it wasn't the tragedy that I was writing about. It was that after my sister's death, my parents didn't speak of her or the murder. It was as if there'd never been a sister. So in The Face Tells the Secret, there is no murdered sister, but there is the sister that no one will refer to. So then, like, fast forward many, many years from that event, in 2004, I was awarded a Fulbright. At that time, I was a single parent and the sole provider for my daughter, Rachel, who was at that time 20 years old. I was living in Tel Aviv and teaching at Beanland University, where I had the great pleasure of meeting Avi, having him as a student. And I managed, this is such a long story, I managed to have my daughter live for a while at a residential community near Carmiel called Kisharit. And I don't know how many people here who are listening know about Kisharit, but it's a kibbutz-like community for adults with neurological disabilities who can live semi-independently. Residents could work at the garden or in the wooden toy factory or in the kennels. And I was completely struck in every way by the beauty of Kisharit, everything about it, the architecture, the stonework, the plantings, the sculptures in the garden, and the fact that the beauty was part of the plan. In the US, I'd been told that my daughter didn't have the skills to ever work. At Kisharit, she worked for the first time and it absolutely changed her life. So these elements, my father's question, wasn't there another one? The shadow of a missing sister, the long, rich period I spent in Tel Aviv, and my daughter who found purpose and community in this incredibly beautiful place. Those were some of the factors from my own life that over a period of many years made their way into this novel. There's one other element that is sort of mysterious to me, but early on, I wrote this scene that's actually in the very beginning of the books. It's just a paragraph, so I'll read it. If I can find it. One day, I would see them in a large heated pool, a man cradling a woman, swirling her in the water in dreamy figure eights, dancing almost. The woman in his arms was so limp, neck arched and head thrown back, long legs dangling. I tried to imagine the pale man was a prince and she was the princess he would rouse from decades of sleep with a kiss. I tried to think this unsettling sight was a dream, but the acrid smell of chlorine and the fat keys from a rental car that bulged into my pocket were of this world in a way the two of them were not. I would see all this, but not yet. So this mysterious man came to me and I wrote these scenes and I couldn't get rid of them. At the same time, I will confess, I really did not want to write about disability anymore because I'd written so much about disability related to my daughter. And in some way, I kept thinking, you know, I have other issues in my life, other things that I really care about. And so I want to be able to leave this behind. But this man would not go away. I mean, that's the only way I can describe it. And so then I thought, okay, he's there. He's a piece of the story. And he's a major piece of the story, it turns out. But there was one other thing that I needed to do once I decided that, okay, this man is in the story and disability is going to be part of the story, is that Kisharit, the residents of Kisharit live, as I said, pretty independently. The sibling no one speaks about in my version of Kisharit is profoundly disabled. And so I really had to take the philosophy of Kisharit and I had to imagine a different kind of kibbutz-like home for life. And that is one for people with profound disabilities. And I know in a way why that interested me. I mean, I just think people, for a lot of people, there's a kind of hierarchy of love, who's worthwhile loving and who isn't worthwhile loving. And I think there are a lot of people who really disregard the humanity of people with profound disabilities. So this interested me again as a parent and a person. And so I had this man and I didn't know if this was possible. Would a strange man be cradling this very disabled woman in a pool? Could this happen? And so I did a little research and I found a residential community, not like Kisharit, but a very, a pretty extraordinary place. And I did a little research and I found out that yes, well, why not was the answer. Why could this not be possible? And so I realized, yes, I'm going to be writing a novel. It's going to have disability in it. And yes, I can, this man who means so much to me as a character and these scenes and this kind of unsentimental love can be something that I can write about. So I think I have a little time to read a little bit. So I'm going to read a very short section from the beginning, and this is about my my narrator, whose name is Roxanne, and her mother's name is Leona Garlick. She is a PhD physicist at Bell Laboratories in New Jersey, and this is from childhood. And Julie, wave at me if I go too long, okay? I cannot remember her in everyday life at the dinner table, watching a show on TV, wearing pants, only waiting for her, knocking on the door of the office she'd set up in the house my parents bought near Bell Labs, pink from my bath, teeth brushed, dressed in PJs. Her office was cluttered with books and journals, towers of stacked trays and gifts she'd been given over the years, a red tasseled scroll from China, a netsuke from Japan, a ceramic burrow, a brass clock inscribed with her name, knocking softly, daring to open the door an inch. She might swivel in her chair, might lean over, might let me put my lips to her cheek carefully. Even then, I knew she did not like to be touched. Also as a treat was being allowed to sit on the edge of her bed while she dressed for an evening event, or on the top step when the scientists came over, where I could see her in the wing chair, waving her arms languidly while she spoke, cigarette between her fingers, legs in sheer hose, the way the room went silent while she spoke, the way they waited to laugh until she did, these men. And they were all men in those days, and she was the queen. Once a visitor from another country wanted to say hello to me, and my mother had called warmly from the bottom of the stairs, "Roxanne, come and meet our guest." She escorted me into the living room and let me stay until 9 o'clock. I know because she said, all right, upstairs, 9 o'clock. On another night, I raced downstairs after the company had left crying, Mommy, and was stopped by her angry visage. Aren't you a little old to call me Mommy? How old had I been? 6, 7? After that, I had not known what to call her and was too shy to ask. Mommy was too babyish. Mom was like a dumpling caught in my throat. Mama was too European. Mother was the name used by the scrubbed, well-mannered children in the stories I loved when Nanny escorted them into the drawing room to say goodnight. My classmates brought in ant farms and erector sets for show and tell. I asked my mother if I could bring her, and she said yes. The morning she was to come to school, she wore a tweed suit, a silk blouse, and long gold chains, one with a watch and a locket. It was also thrilling, the heels of her pump clicking on the old wood floor, the word pumps, the square briefcase she carried with its brass lock that clicked smartly like a soldier's salute. The way she stood in front of the room, the teacher moved to the corner where she sat knock-kneed in a small chair while my mother leaned against her desk. The children's hands went up. I watched with pride as she pointed a polished nail to call on a boy. Her answers were so patient. No, she was not a medical doctor. She was a scientist. No test tubes were used in her lab. She had electronic equipment. I got a hall pass so I could walk her to the front door of the school and stand with her until my father pulled up outside. After my parents drove away, I skipped back to my classroom, heels noisy on the linoleum. I felt special as I slipped into my seat. All afternoon, I was swollen with pride. My mother. At recess, a boy said, why does she talk like that? Like what? I said. Our teacher said Dr. Garlic grew up in another country and has an accent. No, she doesn't, I said. Later, I was able to hear her as that boy had done. I could detect the subtle differences, the way she'd mastered the W except when she was mad, but the TH continued to elude her. Den you will go without dinner. But at the time, what the boy and teacher said felt like accusations, and they were wrong. My mother didn't have an accent or come from somewhere else. But what were we? A year or two later, while I'm leaning against a damp brick wall at recess, picking at the mortar, a moon-faced girl walks over. She stands very close and scrutinizes me, hair, blouse, shoes. She squints as if to see beneath my clothes and asks, what are you? I don't know what to tell her, but I think maybe my father does, since he's a teacher. When he gets home, I ask, what am I? The question makes him uneasy. Who wants to know, he asks. A girl at school, I say. Why, is she an anti-Semite? What's an anti-Semite? I follow him to his office, watch him open the clasp of his accordion briefcase and arrange the papers on his desk. When he goes to the bathroom, I prop myself against the door, smell the cigarette smoke that escapes from the gap near the floor, wait for the flush, then slide into a sitting position against the wall while he goes to the bathroom to change his clothes, asking, until eventually I understand that Jewish is the answer to what are you? The definition of anti-Semite is people who don't like us. I'm Jewish, I tell the girl the next time she approaches. She studies me in that same up-down way, hair, clothes, shoes, and says, I'm Catholic, and walks away. But what is Jewish? My parents considered themselves more fully evolved than our church-going neighbors with their bathtub virgins, or the typical suburban Jews with their kosher kitchens who ate spare ribs and shrimp at the local Chinese restaurant. We had no Hanukkah bush. Like some of these families, we celebrated no holidays, had no family traditions, no siblings, cousins, uncles, aunts. It seemed then that Jewish was a category, a label for a box, but the box was empty. When asked my religion, I learned to say nothing. Later, when it puzzled friends who knew I was born in Israel and that my father taught at a Jewish school, my answer became more insistent. We were nothing. It was a milder response than the one given by my mother, who often held forth on her hatred of all religion.
Thank you, Jane. That was great.
Thanks.
I encourage all of you to get The Face Tells the Secret. It's amazing. That was great. And we can have questions for Jane afterwards. And now I'm gonna move on to our second author, Avner Landis. So let me read you his bio. and I don't have his book yet. It's coming. Book Depository tells me it will be on its way soon. So I can't hold it up, but you've all seen the graphic of it. Yeah, Avi, hold it up. Avner Landis earned his MFA from Columbia University, and works as a ghostwriter and editor. He grew up in Skokie, Illinois, in a family that came to Chicagoland in the early 1900s, and he now lives in Givat Shmuel, a suburb of Tel Aviv, with his wife and 2 children. Meiselman, The Lean Years is his first novel, and Publisher Weekly says, Landy's dark, funny debut chronicles a suburban schlemiel's endless capacity for self-sabotage. Fans of Shalom Auslander will appreciate this. So, Avi, take it away.
All right. Thank you so much, Julie. It's really a pleasure to be here, and really thank you for what you've built. I'm a longtime participant of the series, and it's nice to be on the other side. And thank you, Rachel, for doing this with me. And Jane, it's really very special for me to be doing this with you. I'm also going to try not to cry, but I was thinking about this, and I think a lot of writers will tell you that the great teachers sit with you when you work, and they kind of pop into your head at certain moments. And Jane is certainly one of those teachers for me. So this is really special for me. And thank you to everyone showing up. I see a lot of family, friends, new friends, and it's really a great crowd. It's great to see everyone. So my book is Meiselman, The Lean Years, and it's a story about a 36-year-old man who works as an events and programs coordinator at the New Niles Public Library in suburban Chicago. And at the book's outset, Meiselman suffers a series of humiliations, including ones at the hands of Izzy Schenkenberg, who's a celebrated writer, a former schoolmate, and an upcoming speaker at the library. Meiselman, early on in the book, after suffering these humiliations, determines he's going to unleash his aggression. And every ordinary encounter is turned into a struggle of wills, a zero-sum confrontation. An internal narrative revolves around the question of how others will perceive him and whether he is winning or losing any given interaction. And I guess the book really, it's about many things, obviously, but one thing it's about is, can someone just determine to break lifelong patterns and be a different person? Of course, I don't want to give too much away, but this is not a worthwhile project for the protagonist, and it will only further alienate him. Meiselman is a man, he's incapable of authentic connections with other people, not even with himself. Meiselman asks at one point in the book, if I'm not for myself, who will be for me? Ignoring the more crucial question, if I'm only for myself, who am I? And now I guess I want to talk about, why Meiselman, give you a little kind of background of why I started writing this novel. I went to go do my MFA in New York, and I'd been writing for a while. I felt like my writing had kind of stalled. And when I got to New York, I was, coming from Israel, and I don't know, I felt this like obligation to write about Israel, to write about the situation. And I didn't really even know what I wanted to say. And I don't even think it really interested me, but I think I felt like that's what people expected of me. Like that's why I was there, and that's what I was supposed to be writing, and that's what would interest people. And I would write these stories, and they were okay. They were like very correct, like very, minimalist style, like try to keep the sentences very short and correct. And I try not to be too provocative. And I like the stories were fine, but then I'd go to workshop and I'd get the feedback, and they would, people would say, oh, you should be doing this, you should do that. And I would just leave workshop, and I would wouldn't care. I would just say I don't care to work on that story anymore. I don't like it. And then, almost in the middle of my second year, I was just, sitting one night, getting ready to start working on a new submission. I don't know, maybe I had a beer or two. I'm not really sure. It was very late, I remember. And I I mean, I will say, like, I'd been reading a lot of different things, and I'd been reading all these writers who, were saying to me, like, do this, this is what you want to be doing. So that's what you should be writing. And like, don't listen to, what's considered acceptable, or what is expected of you. And I just sat down, I started writing, and yeah, I mean, that was it. Like, I started this book, and I didn't want to stop writing it. So I'm going to read that paragraph, because that paragraph really hasn't changed at all. That first paragraph. I'd say the only difference is it's, like 6 years into writing the book, that first paragraph ended up going near the end of the book. It's on page 315 now. So, but it's pretty much the same paragraph. I'll read that. The 3-bedroom, 2-story colonial is settling, and its aching floorboards jolt Meiselman awake. The sound strikes his heart like a sustained note of an out-of-tune piano. He fears the house is on the verge of collapse, its machinery on the brink of combustion. Before any decision to grab the wife and vital documents, passports, dowry, he attempts to verify the noise, to eliminate the possibility the disturbance is merely residue from a dream. Limbs stiffen, breathing halted, Meiselman thinks he hears something outside the bedroom, a shoe testing the hallway floor. So that's now on page 315. But now I'm going to read a bit of a longer section. This takes place earlier in the book. There's not much you need to know, except Meiselman is going to Shoal with his wife. Her name is Dina. I'm going to hold up the book one more time so you can see the cover.
Do extreme close-up of the title. There you go.
Here's the title.
Okay.
Yeah. All right, so I'm going to do a reading now. How his son can degrade himself by sitting in the back of the men's section with the riffraff, the scoffers, the proudly tardy, the new members with no standing, men who will never be asked to be officers, who do not pay full dues, and who step out after the Torah reading to drink whiskey in the kitchen, his father does not understand. The people in the front rows, the officers, the board members, men who have been coming since the Shoal's founding, men who post plaques commemorating the deceased, talk just as much as the men in the back rows, he argues to his father. Not as much, and it's about business, and maybe sometimes politics, Israel. It would not hurt to engage in meaningful conversation every now and then, something other than sports, for crying out loud. Should one not sit with one's contemporaries? Goofballs who talk Narishkeit? Can one not be a positive influence, an island of piety? Besides, it's not the backpack, it's more the middle. Harvey, leave him alone. Let him sit with his friends if he wants to. Another example of his father not having steered him wrong. Meiselman should have heeded his father's advice and taken a seat closer to the front. Now, for as long as the two men attend the same shul, or until Meiselman has a son to use as a buffer, he will be stuck every Shabbat morning feeling squeezed by Ben Davis's hulking body. The shoulders of the two men rub, their knees knock, yet only Meiselman shrinks in a seat. Today, this inability to own his space is frustrating Meiselman more than usual. The woolly smell of Ben Davis's pilly sweater, which he wears even during the summer, sticks in Meiselman's nose, its stray fibers tickling his neck. In spite of a main sanctuary that seats 700, the Shoal is neither august nor awesome. Its gray industrial carpeting, fluorescent lighting, walls painted a simple white, and rows constructed out of stackable chairs, gray fabric, gold trimming, give it the feel of a convention center. At the front of the room is an unadorned stage with an ark whose curtains are a spiritless brown. To the side of it sits the rabbi. A frosted glass partition divides the men from the women. It's usually so freezing in here, Ben Davis says, the same complaint he utters every week before pushing up his sweater sleeves. Spring is here. Time to take off the sweater, Meiselman wants to encourage his seatmate. Wear a blue blazer. Do you not see that every other man is either in a suit or jacket? But they do not have this type of relationship. When Ben Davis wipes his nostrils raw on one of the bathroom paper towels, Meiselman never offers him a tissue from his travel pack. Likewise, Meiselman does not suggest to Ben Davis that he excise the skin tag hanging off his eye, and never has he uttered a word of concern or curiosity about the withering black thumbnail or the black spots dotting his eyeballs. Good week, Meiselman asks. You? A greeting that has become a formality, a way for the two men to segue into their weekly review of the White Sox. 4 hits, no runs, Meiselman says. Run schmuns, Ben Davis responds. The problem is this guy Wright, a below average fastball that he consistently leaves over the plate. The team is only as good as its fifth starter, Meiselman says. That's what worries me about this year's squad. Light physical contact with other men does not generally bother Meiselman. At times, he even finds it pleasurable. The tickle of a barber's infinitesimal snipping, the combs lifting off of the hair, or the tailor running chalk across the rear, or the hair of a woman in a crowd grazing Meiselman's neck. Men, contact with other men is the subject of this meditation. With Ben Davis, Meiselman feels as if his shoulder is sliding off a brick wall. Ben Davis, meanwhile, sits unaware of the touching. Trying to talk his way through this discomfort, Meiselman says, "Did you see that picture of Frink in the paper this morning? Did you see how strong he looks? Strong schmong." Meiselman shushes Ben Davis as the usher comes down this aisle. A ticket for talking during services, $50, all proceeds going to charity, would be a hardship for a man like Ben Davis, presumably, although Meiselman cannot be positive, seeing as how he does not know what the man does for a living. Work is another matter the men do not discuss. Why his lips are always chapped, why his hands have sores on the knuckles, why the president of the shoal comes to him in the middle of services when there is a leak, a decomposing rodent behind the fridge, or a bird trapped in the vent, are some of the questions Meiselman would like to ask Ben Davis. The ushers circulate near the back rows, reluctant to ticket the members in the front. Services finish without any fines. At Kiddish in the social hall, Dina's in a corner with her two new friends, women who wear skirts above the knees and high heels sloped like playground slides. Dina met Molly, the more bejeweled of the two, at a JCC class she took when she was becoming religious for Meiselman. Several feet away, Meiselman stands in a circle with the husbands of Molly and the other woman. Owing to Dina's friendships, Meiselman was thrown into this weekly gathering of men. One of the first conversations was about beer. The other men compared German and Japanese brews. Over and over, Jeremy, Molly's husband, used the word Reinheitsgebot. Meiselman asked for a definition. Jeremy told Meiselman it was a concept beyond definition, something either known or not known. They asked Meiselman what he drinks, and he answered, "I buy American whenever I can." "I hear you," Scott said. "I'm into this good imperial stout called Catbird." For the next several months, the conversation moved to bike riding and then grilling. Today, the men are talking waters. New Mexico Springs is an acidic water I like, Scott says. "Those acidic waters are beyond me," Jeremy says. Jeremy, Molly's husband, is a pediatrician. "Mississippi Pure, anyone?" "Wonderfully sweet." Ben Davis is lurking behind the circle of men, his shaky thumb and index finger delivering a cracker with creamed herring on top to his mouth. Does decency call for Meiselman to step aside and invite Ben Davis into the circle? Does he even have the pull to introduce new members? In the newspapers, Meiselman says, there was something about high levels of lead in the Dale County water system. "Who drink from the tap?" Scott asks. "You," he stabs his finger to Meiselman's chest, "should try Almond Grove." Nipping at the buttons of Meiselman's blue dress shirt, as if checking the shirt's quality, he adds, "medium minerality, a neutral orientation, and it's great for virility." Everyone in the circle laughs. Meiselman spots Ben Davis sucking herring cream off his fingers and wiping his hands on the bottom of his styrofoam plate. On the way home from Shoal, Meiselman tells Dina about his seating issue. "Check my neck. Is it red from the scratching? 2-3 stitches should do the job." She suggests moving seats. "You make jokes and impractical suggestions," Meiselman says. "My own wife, and you can't sympathize. First Schenkenberg and Ethel, then Mrs. Wolf, and now Ben Davis. I'm sick of it. Sick of always being the one left feeling disturbed." That's it. Thank you.
I cannot wait to read this.
Thank
As
you.
a kiss. Okay. Oh, you're getting some heart reactions. Okay, thank you, Avi. We're now going to move to Rachel Beanland. Rachel writes essays and fiction and is the author of the debut novel, Florence Adler Swims Forever. Here it is. You can see. Okay, it's a wonderful book. It was released in July 2020 by Simon & Schuster. The book was selected by the Barnes & Noble Book Club pick for July. It was named a feature debut by Amazon and an Indie Next pick by the American Booksellers Association. It was also named a New York Times Editor's Choice and one of the best books of 2020 by USA Today, and was recently recognized with the 2020 National Jewish Book Award for debut fiction. So that is amazing. And let me unmute you now, Rachel. And I'm gonna be done. If any of my family and friends are on this call, there's a very strong Atlantic City connection here. So Rachel will tell us about it now.
Julie, thank you so much for having me. This is really fun. I'm excited to be doing an international event. Avi and Jane, very nice to share the virtual stage with you. Thank you all so much for coming. Julie is correct. I wrote Florence Adler Swims Forever. And I guess I'll start and I'll tell you a little bit about the book, and then I'll tell you a little bit about the story behind the book, because it is based on a true story that took place in my family about 90 years ago. Florence Adler Swims Forever is set in 1934 Atlantic City, and it follows the Adler family over the course of one summer as they are mourning the loss of a daughter, a 20-year-old daughter, Florence, who has drowned training to swim the English Channel. Her sister, Fanny, her older sister, is pregnant and in the hospital on bed rest. She's lost a baby the summer before. And so the family makes the decision, and really kind of spearheaded by the matriarch of the family, Esther, makes the decision not to tell her that her sister has died. Basically they kind of all go in on this secret. And the novel really follows this family over the course of about 2 months as they are keeping this, devastating secret from Fanny in the hospital. And of course, it has far-reaching consequences on all members of the family, as well as a few friends that are closely connected to the family. It is based on, people have read the book, and sometimes I hear from people and they'll say, well, I just didn't think it was very realistic. And to which I say, I'm sorry, but it's actually based on a true story that took place in my family. When my grandmother was a little girl, she was 6 years old, on the beach in Atlantic City one summer day. And her Aunt Florence, who was training to swim the English Channel, her body was brought back up onto the beach. She had been out for a training swim. And my grandmother, became one of her earliest childhood memories, and obviously one of her most traumatic childhood memories. She said she remembered two things about that day. She remembered the red bathing cap that Florence was wearing, and she remembered the sound of her grandmother's wails on the beach, as she realized, what had happened. That summer, my grandmother really was staying with her grandmother because her mother was in the hospital on bed rest. And so they did have this rather difficult decision to make in terms of whether to tell my great grandmother, who was in the hospital, about, her sister's death. And they decided not to tell her and kept the secret until a baby had been born. I was always very, very interested in this story. It was something that I grew up learning about. I think in my kind of earliest memories, my mother was telling me the story as a means of convincing me that I needed to wait an hour after eating lunch before I could get back in the pool. It was like, we had someone in our family who drowned. You've got to wait. She was always, the story just was always there in the background. I always used to kind of hear anyone who told the story in our family in the same breath would say, we had someone in the family who drowned. Her name was Florence, and she drowned training to swim the English Channel. That was an important component of the story. But as I got older, and I would hear my mother and her sisters talk about the story, and occasionally my grandmother talk about the story, the part that was so important to everybody, and really what they just kind of couldn't get away from, was not so much that Florence had died. Of course, that was tragic, but in the 80s and 90s, when I was hearing the story, it had happened a long, long time ago. The part that they kind of couldn't let go of was that, we'll call her Esther in the book because that's her name in the novel. That what a strong woman Esther must have been, my great grandmother, to be able to walk into that hospital room and act like everything was fine. To make such a sacrifice and kind of put her own grief on hold in order to go in and convince her surviving daughter that all was well. The women in my family kind of universally believed that Esther had made the right decision in keeping the death a secret from her surviving daughter. And as I was growing up, I really kind of questioned that decision. probably it's partially just my generation. We lean a little more towards transparency. And I think I also saw the ways in which because my family had elevated Esther's decision to such an extent, I saw the ways in which we were kind of continuing to live by that coda. Like there were a number of things we would not tell my grandparents, for instance, for fear of making them worry. You never ever wanted them to worry. And so, in their later years, I feel like the list was long of things that we had not told them. It was almost hard to keep straight all the things we hadn't told them, which made it difficult when you would see them to kind of keep your story straight. Like, oh, right, we're not talking about that. And I remember just thinking, well, what is the point of having family and having this closeness if there are all these things you're not saying, and if in your darkest moments you're not able to look to them for support. And so I think when I set out to write the novel, I had decided that I would try to to fictionalize it, use the story as kind of a base, and then create a whole fictional world around it. But I think that when I set out to write it, I was really thinking that I would almost use the opportunity of writing this book to kind of prove my mother and maybe her sisters wrong, right? To say, no, I think that a little transparency would have gone a long way in this particular situation. What I found as I wrote the book, I wrote the book from 7 rotating perspectives. So we, follow along with many members of the family and a few friends in order, and we rotate through a couple of times that way. And so as I was kind of moving through and getting in all these different people's heads, including this matriarch, I of course realized that it's actually much more complicated. And I really realized how much she had been denying herself, in terms of her own grief by maintaining this lie, over the course of the weeks and in my novel's case, months that she was doing it. I thought I would just read a couple of pages from the beginning of the book. I'm not going to read for very long because I know we're getting to the Q&A and that'll be more fun. But I'm just going to read from the very beginning. The beginning is the first person that we encounter is Gussie, who is based on my grandmother. So I knew that I would always have, because the story had been passed down to me through my grandmother. I always knew that I would have one character in the book that was kind of representative of her experience on the beach that day. And so we open the book with the family on the beach. And Florence drowns very quickly in the book. Within the first chapter, she's gone, because really the book is about what happens after she's gone. But so this is where we begin. Gussie Feldman didn't enjoy swimming, but she did like to lie on the wet sand in the shadow of Atlantic City's steel pier and wait for the tiniest ripple of a wave to wash over her. If she positioned herself just so, her body rose with the incoming tide, and for a brief moment, she felt weightless. She was lying in just such a manner, staring up at the bright blue sky, when her Aunt Florence's face came into her field of vision. "I discovered a lovely note when I arrived home," Florence said. "I want to give my compliments to the artist." Gussie grinned. She had devoted more than a quarter of an hour to writing the note, which she'd carefully positioned on the oriental rug in the entryway of her grandparents' apartment, where Florence would be sure to see it. With her colored pencils, she had written in big purple letters, "Dear Florence and Anna, we are at the beach. Come have fun. Love, Gussie." At the last minute, she decided she had not used enough exclamation marks, so she added 3 more after Florence's name, but stopped short of allocating any to Anna. Maybe if her grandparents' house guest noticed she hadn't been awarded any, she'd decide to stay at the apartment. "Do you want to be a mermaid?" Gussie asked Florence now, hoping to capitalize on her aunt's good mood. Sometimes, if Gussie asked sweetly, Florence would cross her legs at the ankles and pretend the two of them were mer people, out for a swim around the Tongan Islands, which Gussie had read about in her picture book, Fairy Tales of the South Seas. "For a few minutes, then I'm going to go out for a swim." Florence lay down beside Gussie in the surf, and the two of them bumped against each other as the waves lapped at their ankles and hips and shoulders. When their skin touched, Gussie felt shy. It was always like this when her aunt returned home from college. It took time for Gussie to relearn Florence's face and the amount of space she took up in a room and the funny way she talked to Gussie like she was both a beloved child and a trusted grown-up. "What do you think of Anna?" Florence asked as she propped herself up on her elbows and gave Anna a wave. It was a hot day and the beach was crowded with people, but Gussie spotted her right away. "I think it's her fault I have to sleep on the sun porch." Florence let out a loud cackle. "Nonsense. I spent my entire childhood begging your Nana and Papa to clear out the sun porch, mainly so I could get away from your mother." She reached out and pinched Gussie in the ribs. "You're a lucky girl." Gussie didn't know about any of that. The sun porch was fine, no tinier in actual fact than her bedroom in her parents' apartment. The room had a bank of windows that faced the ocean, and if she stood on her tiptoes, she could see beyond the pitched roofs of the homes that lined Virginia Avenue, all the way to the beach, where the blue and white umbrellas looked like tiny pinwheels. The view was nice, but on summer mornings when the sun rose over the Atlantic Ocean and its long rays bored through the glass, the room became unbearably hot. In those moments, Gussie wished her grandparents had remained in their house on Atlantic Avenue for the summer. "I wish we weren't in the apartment," she allowed herself to say out loud, since her grandparents were yards away in their beach chairs. In the summer months, Esther and Joseph rented out their house just 1 block from the beach to tourists and moved back into the apartment above the bakery, where, Esther reminded anyone who complained, the family had lived quite happily when Florence and her older sister Fanny were small. "Do you know how many summers I spent wishing I weren't in that apartment?" Florence asked. "How many?" "God, I have no idea," she said, sending a small splash of water in Gussie's general direction. It was a rhetorical question. "What's rhetorical mean?" Florence looked up at the sky and thought for a moment. "Something you say because it sounds good, but not because you actually expect an answer from anyone." "Then why say it?" "Because it's better than saying nothing at all." She squeezed a handful of sand through her fingers. "But when you put it like that, it makes me wonder if we shouldn't all just tell each other what we mean." Gussie scrunched up her nose and grabbed at her own fistful of sand. What Florence seemed to forget was that since Gussie was only 7, no one ever told her anything, one way or the other. Everything she'd ever learned about anything she had learned by keeping quiet and paying attention. Take her mother's confinement, for instance. She first learned her mother, Fanny, was expecting another baby because she'd overheard her say something to Mrs. Kingman when they had stopped by her shop for a pair of stockings. She guessed the pregnancy was risky because she'd heard her grandfather warn her mother to be careful on several different occasions in recent months. And she knew Dr. Rosenthal had recommended strict bed rest at Atlantic City Hospital because her mother had repeated his prescription to Esther when she'd returned from a recent doctor's appointment. There had been a good bit of debate between Gussie's mother and grandmother over what to do with Gussie while her mother was on bed rest. Remaining with her father, Isaac, had turned out to be out of the question. Gussie knew this because she had overheard Esther tell Fanny so in precisely those words. "Gussie remaining at your apartment is out of the question." Gussie was sure her father would balk when he learned that her mother intended to send her to live with her grandparents for the summer. But as her mother's confinement neared, not a word was said about the plan one way or the other. The day before Fanny was to be admitted to Atlantic City Hospital, she packed Gussie's summer clothes and bathing suit, some of her books, her jacks, and coloring pencils away in an old suitcase. The bag sat in the apartment's narrow hallway, a boulder that Isaac had to step over to get to the kitchen. When Gussie could no longer stand his silence on the subject, she begged, "Father, can't I stay with you here?" Gus, Isaac said, as if he were going to give her a straightforward response. What in the world would we get into knocking about by ourselves? Gussie had begun to wonder if her entire life might be rhetorical, no answers for any of it, when Florence pulled her back to the present. "Remember, knees and heels together. If you're a mermaid, you can only move your feet. I mean fins." Gussie pushed off the sandy bottom and scooted through the waves, using her arms to steer and kicking her tail fiercely. Always she was careful to keep her chin above water. "How do I look?" she called over her shoulder, but Florence wasn't watching her, wasn't even looking in her direction. Instead, she sat in the breaking waves, studying the shore. Gussie circled back, waving a hand in front of Florence's face. "Let's pretend you're the mermaid in the glass tank at Steel Pier, and I'll swim from Australia to save you." "Why do I need to be saved?" said Florence, who still looked very far away. "Don't I like my life at the pier?" "You want to be free to swim about in the ocean, silly." Florence turned to face Gussie then, giving her niece her full attention. "Yes, you're quite right. I nearly forgot." All right.
That's great. And now that I hear you reading that chapter, I see so much foreshadowing that, right? Why do I need to be saved? And nobody ever tells Gussie anything. And meanwhile, now in the rest of the book, she is privileged to be in this secret society of the Florence Adler Swims Forever Society, because they're keeping it from her mom. So she is in the know. Okay, there's a bunch of questions that have just been coming in. Rachel, they seem like first ones are all for you. Was it a thing back then for young women to try to swim the English Channel? I'll just read a few of these questions so you can answer them at once. When will your book be out in paperback? And Rachel, because your novel is based in family history, did you feel family or individual pressure to tell the story a certain way? And to what extent did you feel free to deviate from and imagine your own story from this personal legacy?
Great. Okay. Well, it's coming out in paperback June 1. So you don't have too much longer to wait on that. And as for, yes, in terms of swimming the English Channel, that was one of the first things I did when I decided I was going to write this book and fictionalize this family story. The very, very first question I had was, what in the world was she doing swimming the English Channel? I knew that had always been an important component of the story. And I could not for the life of me figure out why she had been doing that. And so I started to read a bunch of biographies on Trudy Ederle, who was the first woman to swim the English Channel. She was an American woman. And very quickly, it became obvious to me what was happening and why my great-great-aunt would have been so obsessed with this particular goal. Trudy Ederle attempted to swim the channel for the first time in 1925. A couple of men had done it, but no women had yet accomplished the feat. And she tried in 25, and her coach tapped her out, which, if you're one of the rules of swimming the English Channel, is nobody can touch you the whole time. Her coach tapped her out very late in the swim, like when she'd already been in the water, I don't know, 10, 12 hours, something like that. And so it ruined her chances for the year. So she was very upset that it had happened. And she went to the papers with it and really like accused him of sabotaging her. So the result was that in 26, when she went back to do it again, to try it again, she took a different coach, she hired a different coach, and the papers were very, very interested in seeing whether she would make it this time, because there had been this whole brouhaha with the coach. And so she did make it, but the way that it works for swimming the channel is that you kind of sit around in France for days and weeks waiting for the right currents and the right weather conditions to be able to swim. So there was something, every day in the paper for weeks about like, is Trudy going to swim today? Is this the day? So that would have been happening in 26, which was the exact year that my great-great-aunt graduated from high school. So it is not a surprise that when I dug up her yearbook in the local archives in Atlantic City, it was like, her future goals were like, I want to be swimming the Atlantic Ocean. And she was very inspired by what was happening around her. And there weren't a lot of women swimming in that era. We were just beginning to teach girls to swim. Before that, they just weren't learning. But Trudy Ederle would have been a complete inspiration. So that's a little bit about the channel. And then the last question about my family and what they thought of this whole thing. My family's been really supportive and sweet about it. I mean, I think my mother is the one that had the biggest issue in terms of the fact that, for me, I was writing about these people, but with the exception of my grandmother, who, of course, I didn't know as a little girl, I knew her as an older woman. I didn't know these people. I never interacted with them because they were too many generations removed. My mother knew many of them. And so for her, it was so odd to read a novel that had these people in it that she thought of as, being, of course, real people. But she said it took her about 2/3 of the way through reading it the first time to kind of let go of the family members that she was associating with these characters and then just purely read it as fiction.
Great. Thank you. Avi, there's a question for you here. What are the lean years opposed to? Is it biblical? I've kind of been wondering the same thing.
Sorry, I was mute. You lost that gem I just delivered. Sorry, I'll start again. Yeah, so it's certainly biblical. I mean, for starters, it's a scene in the book. There's a scene in the book. I always thought it would be funny to name the book The Lean Years because it's a really long book. And at one point it was like 650 pages. So I thought it was a pretty solid joke. But basically Meiselman, all of his years have been lean. I mean, the 36 years he's been alive have been lean years. And there is this question of he has a moment in the book where early on where he starts to wonder about the lean years and the fat years, and he can't remember which comes first, the fat years or the lean years. And for him, this is his question, is he going to give up the lean years and head into some fat years, or is there no chance that he will ever have fat years? So yes, that's it.
Okay. Other people must have more questions.
I have a
That's
question
real-
for Jane. Can I ask Jane a question?
Yeah.
Something you were talking about, it's kind of something I've always just wondered about your writing career is like you're always moving into different forms, like in and out of different forms. And I was wondering creatively, like how that works, and at what moment are you sure, like, yes, this is going to be a memoir or even like a children's book? Are you ever like, this is a good children's book, but this would be even better as a novel? And you just go with it, or are you ever like second guessing yourself as you like during the process of writing?
Well, I mean, I think the beginning for essays and memoir is really different from like for fiction. So for fiction, the beginning for me is always the dynamics between characters. It's that kind of situation. I think the essays and the memoir begin with mulling over something. I mean, I always describe myself as sort of like a dog with a bone. I'm like a chewer, a ruminator. And so the nonfiction stuff starts with ruminations. And then what happens is because story interests me so much, so then I find the story, I find the container for the rumination afterwards. The children's book is a whole other situation, which I'll try and be really brief about. But the children's book is actually based on a true story of very old friends of mine who emigrated from Novosibirsk, and they managed to smuggle their dog Gina. And I asked them about that, and I knew for many, 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 many years that I wanted to write that story because I knew Gina the dog, and I would see her in my friend's yard, and I gave her like an interior voice, and I would imagine her dreaming of the pine forests at home and feeling really dislocated. And so that grew out of that. And my daughter's piece is that at some point I said to her, I really want to write this story about Gina. And she's a filmmaker, as you know, and she just said, let's do it. And so together, it took many years, but together we put it together with an illustrator from Moscow. That's how that happened. So different, I think things come different ways, and the shape then becomes evident in the way I'm thinking about it.
I have a question for all three of you, and that is, what are you working on now? And have you found that your writing during the last year in the pandemic, has it changed? Are you more able to write one genre or another? For me, it's been much easier, and I'm not really a nonfiction writer, but it's some like creative nonfiction and some essays have come much easier than fiction for me. So Jane, why don't you start?
COVID has been such disaster for millions of people. For me as a writer, it's actually been a pretty fertile period of time because I'm not going anyplace. And so I'm living with my stories, and I finished a draft of a new novel. And so that's mainly what I'm working on.
I guess
Rachel?
yeah. I've also been working on a new novel. It's set in a different, it's still historical fiction, but I'm going further into the past this time. I'm going all the way back to 1811. So it's requiring a lot of research. And it is funny how the pandemic changes your creativity and your creative output. I had an idea for a different novel, but it was going to require a lot of travel. And I had started working on it. But when the pandemic hit, I thought, this is not going to work right now. Like, I don't know when the next time I'm going to be able to get on a plane is. And so I ended up switching gears and starting work on a novel that is set in my hometown. It's based on an event that happened in Richmond, Virginia, 200 years ago. So
Cool. Okay, Avi. How about you?
Yeah, I was working on a novel before the pandemic. I'd written a few hundred pages. Then once the pandemic hit, it was just really kind of tough for novel writing. Just like with, between the kids being home and being on Zoom, and then having to find time to do my actual day job. So I started writing short stories. I'm a really bad short story writer. But it kind of became something for me to do during the pandemic. It was fun. It was a good challenge. And I felt it was easier to kind of get back into a short story for some reason than a novel. I don't know exactly why. Maybe I just didn't have good control over the stories. So I'm not really sure why, but I hope to get back to the novel in the next couple of weeks.
To me, short stories are just much less daunting than a novel. I don't know. That's right. That's
A different
how I got my
challenge.
start,
Yeah.
so, yeah. Okay, some more questions have come in. To those of you who have moved from the USA to Israel, I guess that's you, Avi.
And you.
How did going on Aliyah influence and affect your writing, both in terms of practical issues and influences?
Yeah, I mean, I was living in Israel for 10 years, and then I lived in New York for 10 years. I'm kind of happy because for me to write about a place, I really need to create distance. I'm always worried that if something is too recent, I'm trying to go for accuracy, which is not what I want. I'm more interested in, for example, my book takes place in Chicago, which was where I grew up. So I'm more interested in, like, what are the things I remember and why do I remember them? That becomes interesting. And then being able to manipulate those things, exaggerate them, whatever, that becomes interesting. So now I'm kind of happy. Like, I left New York, and now I think I can write a little more about New York. Other than that, it doesn't really, affect my writing in any way, at least not that I can feel. Yeah.
That's good. I don't have a good answer for that question either when I get asked it. Okay, Rachel, did you spend time in Atlantic City? Did you grow up there? And
I did not grow up there. So my grandparents both grew up there, and then they moved away, to start their careers and that kind of thing. And my mother had a lot of fond memories of going back to Atlantic City in the summers to visit her grandparents, and had that experience in the 50s and 60s. But by the time I came along, my great grandparents were gone, and there wasn't much reason to return to Atlantic City. My grandparents retired elsewhere. So when I set out to write the book, I had, some stories my grandparents had told me. I wish I had done a better job of taking notes, of course, when they were talking all those years. I did not. I did interview my grandmother one time, once or twice, when I was just starting to work on the novel, just to ask some kind of more specific questions about growing up in Atlantic City. But for the most part, I really had to start from scratch, just like it was any other, place that I would need to research. Atlantic City was a really rich place to do research, because of the fact that it was always a tourist town from the very, very beginning in the 1860s, 1870s when it was established. And so there is a really wide array of materials that are available in terms of travel guides and postcards and photographs and just all kinds of souvenirs and ephemera. So it was it was doable to recreate Atlantic City, you know, in my mind's eye. And the most rewarding moments, I think, of publishing this novel are like just yesterday, I got an email from a guy who's got to be 98 or something. I mean, you know, he's definitely, because he remembered, he said, "Oh my God, I can't believe all the stuff you got right." And he remembered meeting my great grandfather, like, you know, when he grew up in Atlantic City. Anyway, just those kind of stories do feel really, really great. You know, it makes me realize like, okay, I got it down. Okay.
That's great. As someone who's spent a lot of time at the shore in Atlantic City, because that's where my husband is from, and hoping that we'll make it there this summer. I think it's great. And yeah, I recognize some of the, you know, obviously current Atlantic City is not the same as
Right. Yeah.
back then, but some of the names even, I'm like, hey, I think that's, you know, like, I think I've heard of that store, or been to that store. Avi, how does your job as a ghostwriter influence your own fiction writing?
I'd say more from like, well, there's a couple ways, but certainly from a craft perspective, I feel like it's helped me. It's really challenging to, let's say, work on my novel when I'm ghostwriting a book, because I mean, ghostwriting a book is almost like working on a novel. You're getting into the book's rhythm, and you're, you know, falling asleep thinking about the book, trying to, you know, figure out problems like you would in your own writing. But I think it's taught me not to be so precious with my writing. That's been really important. Where I used to agonize, you know, over these decisions, and I would come to a decision, but then think, oh no, I still have to keep, you know, the last 8 versions of this one paragraph. You know, ghostwriting, when it's not yours, you know, it's easier to, you know, think it through, make the decision, and move on. And it's taught me how to do that with my own writing for sure. And you know, I meet a lot of really interesting people who do a lot of really interesting things in terms of work. And you know, Stanley Elkin, the writer, always says he starts with the person's job, and I think I really understand that now, because you can see a person through the job they do every day. Doesn't necessarily define them, but it helps. That's how they show themselves, I think, is through their job, right? The language they use, the way they see relationships and human interaction. So yeah.
And Meiselman, like the job is a big part of his job, is a big part of the book, right?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. Well, yeah.
But I've never actually asked you this. I know you're like, what kinds of books are you ghostwriting? Are you writing for like a business leader? Like what?
Yeah, everything. I've done a book. I did a book for a politician who was, running for Congress. He lost. I did a lot of
Not
books
because
about
of the book, though.
do a lot of books about how like 7 easy steps to becoming a millionaire. I think a lot of those types of books. A lot of like life hacking books. How to like get the most out of your life. I wrote a book for a guy. He was a life hacker, and everything was about like maximizing your time and like how to read like super fast. And this guy, he was either half an hour late to every call, or he would just forget about the call. And then one time we were on the phone, and he's like, "Oh, I got to go. They're towing my car. I have like 8 unpaid parking tickets." So I don't know. I think he was writing the book for himself.
Did you take some of his advice though? Like, where did you ever find like you're taking the advice?
I try to make my bed in the morning. Apparently, that's very important. So.
Oh, that's good to know. Okay. Ellen Tuckman is asking if any of the authors will be part of a Zoom with their Brandeis book group next year.
Sure.
Yeah. Think Jane, sorry, why are you muted? Let me unmute you. Yes, Jane says yes. Avi, I'm gonna assume that you're yes also.
Yes.
Okay, wait, was there another question that came in? Well, Sarah Livin said ghostwriting must be such a good exercise in voice to throw and adopt all these different voices.
Yeah, I mean, it goes back. Yeah, it's for sure the hardest part of ghostwriting a book is you can sit there for like a week and you're just listening to the recordings of the person and you're just trying to find the person's rhythm and the way they construct sentences. And that I actually think is the hardest part of writing a book. I mean, once I get that down, once I get that first chapter, like I'm off to the races. But that first chapter, I mean, which is really the same with writing. I think the other writers here will agree. Like that's the hardest part of writing is just getting started and finding the voice that works for that project. Yeah.
Okay, Michelle has a comment and a question. I'm drawn to the name Meiselman. Just wonder what the non-Jews will pick up from that.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of Hebrew in the book, and there's a lot of Yiddish in the book, and like I don't know, I kind of like the way I think of it is, you know, I lived in New York City where there's so many different languages being spoken. You can be on the subway and you hear these interactions, and you don't understand half of what's going on, but you create the interaction. And that's true even when you speak the person's language. Some, like today, I heard this woman like yelling on the phone, and I understood what she was saying, but I couldn't hear the person on the other end. But we create these stories in our minds, and I think that's like the fun of reading is not always getting everything. I mean, there are books I read that are it's all in English, and I don't get 100% of it. But whatever you get, and you try to complete the picture on your own, and that's the fun of reading. Yeah.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, I also got that question because some of the stories in my book are very Jewish, and some are like there's not really a lot of Jewish content in it, but still it resonated enough with my publisher, who's the guy from Winston-Salem, North Carolina, and I don't, and that first story he read of mine was a very Jewish one, and he kept him going. So I figured, okay, if it resonated with him, then that's good. That's good news. Okay, Abigail is asking, did you all attend writing workshops or courses? If so, were they helpful?
I have a good story about that. When I started writing this book, I was not in an MFA program at the time, but there was the MFA program down the street from me at Virginia Commonwealth University had a novel writing workshop, a 2-semester novel writing workshop. And so I asked special permission if I could join it as just a community member. Like I sent in a work sample, and they let me, sign up for the workshop. And it was extremely important that I did that, because not only was the professor super encouraging and just really a wonderful guy, but I wrote the first 150 pages in the workshop. And then the professor in that workshop, though, ended up introducing me to my agent, so who then turned around and sold the book. So it was a really, it was a question of right time, right place, all the way around. So I'm a big fan.
I'll answer also. So I went to Columbia 2 generations before Avi. And for me, because I never took a creative writing class as an undergraduate, and I wrote in secret for so many years, just the fact of a group of people reading and discussing my story for a long period of time was transformative. It was really, really wonderful for me. And then also to have a community of writers, so that when you're in that sheltered world, it really matters what you do. Because sometimes in the big, ordinary, everyday world, it just seems, when you're working on something for so many years, it seems crazy to be sitting in silence by yourself and working on something day after day after day. But when you're with other writers, it matters. So those 2 things were really important for me. And I have to say also, for those of you who know Laurie Siegel's work, she was my first teacher, and she remains somebody I'm in touch with. She's 94. She still gets up every single day and goes to her computer and writes and still publishes in the New Yorker. So great mentor to have.
Amazing. Avi, even.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, when I was talking about Jane earlier, I don't know if you could hear, but I was kind of fighting back tears. So I guess that's my answer about what a writing course and what a writing teacher can do for you. Like I said, I'm sure I was not a great writer back then, and it's really easy to.
True.
No, but it's really easy, I think, for teachers it's such a hard balance because they're not great to students. There's a lot to find wrong with some of the stories and some of the writing, and you could really focus on it, and that could break someone. And to find that balance where you say, hey, this isn't great now, but it can be awesome, and we just have to do this. And that's what the great teachers do. It's what Jane did, and that's what you learn. That's what you learn in these courses and workshops is you learn, like, yeah, the first time's not going to be great. The second time's not going to be great. Maybe by the 100th draft, it will be something you're proud of.
But
And if I can just add to that, I would like to say that, Avi, I won't say it in front of 65 people or 90 people or whatever, but you did have something special then.
You.
That's what I remember. And I could still tell you what I remember of your writing, but I'll do that privately. So.
That's great. That is great. Well, we're gonna wrap up unless anybody has other questions. But while we're talking about mentors for a second, I just want to give a shout out to Evan Fallenberg, who's my mentor and on this call, even though his video is not on. And Evan was some of the words that you said to me when I was taking a writing class with you about that I should keep going, that I have what it takes, and I'm a real writer. All that stuff was like, I mean, I'm sure there was a lot that was wrong with my writing back then, but hearing those words from you were extremely helpful and encouraging to me. So anybody who's a teacher on here, talk to your students, tell your promising students that it really helps. So. Okay, thank you everybody for coming, and thank you very much to Avi and Jane and Rachel for your talks and reading and your insights on writing. I am gonna put the link to the next session in the chat again for anybody who missed it. 1 second. And of course, as you know me, I'll be like, promoting it all over. So I just put the registration for the chat, whatever. I can't speak anymore. It's already late. You know what I mean? You can register for the April event from that link in the chat, or just go to my website. And thank you, everyone. This was great. And if you join late, I recorded the whole thing. I'm going to be sending out a link to the recording tomorrow. So, one more public service announcement. When you read these books, and if you like the books, please leave reviews. They're super important on Amazon and Goodreads and everywhere else, or anywhere that you buy books. It's really hard to get reviews, and so please remember the authors, and you can do them a favor by writing a brief review. So thanks all. Have a great rest of your day, and we will see you soon. Bye.
Thank you.